So, one challenge how you index. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Very warm welcome to you to the Society of Antiquaries. This lunchtime's lecture is, I'm very pleased to say, a joint venture with the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, Society for the Promotion of Roman Studies. Great pleasure to welcome both their presidents here today. But thank you. And I'm very pleased that we're promoting these joint events between our societies. I'm Martin Millett, I'm the president of the Antiquaries, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the lecturer today. David Mattingly is an old friend and colleague of mine. He studied at Manchester University with Barry Jones, and like Barry, he combined interests in the northern provinces of the empire with those central of the empire, and particularly North Africa. He did postdoctoral research, extremely important and influential research on olive oil, and he's had a sort of glittering career since, largely at the University of Leicester, where he's about to retire as Professor of Archaeology, but he spent short periods prior to that in Oxford and, am I right, in Michigan as well. So David is one of the leading proponents of Roman archaeology anywhere in the Roman Empire, and his most recent work has followed earlier fieldwork contributions in Libya and elsewhere in North Africa, most recently turning to Morocco. His subject of his work today is the fantastic painted tombs from Wadi Draa I'm not going to say any more by word of introduction, but to welcome David and invite him to give the talk.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for turning out on such a glorious sunny day. What are you doing inside with me? However, I will try and take you to some sunny places. So in this talk, I'm going to present some preliminary images, analyses, and thoughts about an important new dossier of information on the ancient Saharan ancestor cult. This is the collaborative work of a team of Moroccan and British-based researchers, notably those named on the slide here. Now, while my title seems to be somewhat stretching the remit of our joint societies here present, I think my talk is of relevance to our understanding of the Greco-Roman world and its neighbours. In particular, I shall take us beyond the classical Mediterranean world, but shall reflect on the perceptions of Greco-Roman writers concerning Saharan people. There's a common trope in both ancient and modern accounts of the ancient Sahara that it was sparsely populated by barbarian, primitive peoples who eked out a hard existence through hunting and nomadism. They are commonly described as lightly clad in animal skins or naked, as in the quote from Lucian on the slide. Despite the fact that this has been shown to be a specific sort of colonialist discourse of the barbarian other, such assumptions still persist in much scholarship today. However, my archaeological work, first on the people known as the Garamantes in southern Libya, and now focusing on the Gaetuli in southern Morocco, has started to reveal a different picture about these Iron Age societies, in which at least some of these populations became sedentary oasis cultivators, and they attained a previously unsuspected level of socio-cultural development. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on evidence for a widespread ancestor cult among the peoples of the Northern Sahara at the time of the Roman Empire. I'll first review the evidence from the Libyan Sahara relating to the Garamantes people, then discuss an important pre-desert site of Gerza to the north of the Garamantes, before turning to the new evidence from southern Morocco. These are the areas outlined in blue on the slide. I shall present the discovery of painted images of people from tombs in the northwestern Sahara. These reveal fascinating details of an elaborate Iron Age society that challenge prior assumptions about these desert peoples. The literary evidence pertaining to the religious practices of Saharan populations in antiquity is quite limited, most notably relating to passages in Herodotus and Pomponius Mela, with the latter in part relying on Herodotus as a source, I suspect. Herodotus states, "As for their manner of swearing and divination, they lay their hands on the graves of the men reputed to have been the most just and good among them, and by these men they swear. The practice of divination is to go to the tombs of their ancestors, where, after making prayers, they lie down to sleep and take for oracles whatever dreams come to them." Mela notes that the Algilai, a people of the Libyan desert, think only the ancestors are gods. They swear by them. They consult them as oracles. They pray to the ancestors for what they want, and after they've thrown themselves on burial mounds, the ancestors bring dreams as oracular responses. From these passages, we should be alert for evidence relating to long-term engagement with funerary monuments by descendant communities, including evidence of offering structures and ritual spaces that could be used for communing and sleeping with the spirits of the ancestors. This practice of sleeping alongside the bones of the ancestors is generally known as incubation. In the case of the Garamantes, there are a number of factors of their funerary practices that are suggestive of ancestor worship. Some of the most prominent tombs in the cemetery landscapes had a focus on the east side. This is where funerary stelae were erected and offering tables were placed for performance of regular rituals at the tombs. Some tombs also had low enclosure walls placed on this side, where one can imagine descendants coming to sit or to lie in order to experience revelatory visions. North of the Garamantes in the Libyan pre-desert at Gerza, this is within Roman provincial territory, we can see such ideas taken to another level of elaboration. The large settlement of Gerza appears to have been dominated by two major families or clans, each with a separate cemetery area dominated by monumental tombs. The form of these tombs reflected temple architecture, suggesting a sacred significance that is otherwise, interestingly, rather lacking in this pre-desert society. There are very few actual temples that have been found across a vast zone of the pre-desert. Inscriptions from the North Cemetery emphasize the duty of descendants of the leading family members to visit the tombs to fulfill obligations, and also refer to a parentalia ritual that featured the sacrifice of 51 bulls and 38 goats. It's not the canonical Roman parentalia we're dealing with here. Other aspects of the tombs are very suggestive of the observance of a Libyan ancestor cult here. For instance, the portraits that decorate some of the tombs and the few Latin inscriptions show the significance of celebrating such family relationships and honoring the ancestors. The relief carvings that adorn the tombs emphasize the power and authority of these leading families at the regional, not just the local level. Powerful ancestors were celebrated after death in such images to reinforce the authority of their descendants, but also, I think, because ancestors were depended on for more practical, divine advice and assistance too, in the manner that Herodotus and Mela suggested. As noted, the Libyan pre-desert has very few proper temple structures, but a plethora of highly decorated mausolea of the type we find at Gerza. And I've suggested that these communities interacted with chthonic forces at these funerary loci via the intermediation of ancestors. In both the monumental cemeteries at Gerza, there was one very different structure that stands out from the temple-like tombs that surround them. This was a two-room structure with a closed chamber accessible via a small opening in its east wall from a second room that could be accessed from outside the monument. My suggested interpretation for these is that these were dream houses, with the descendant communities able to bring some bones or relic relating to specific ancestors from the adjacent temple tombs and place them temporarily in that funerary chamber, with a living descendant then able to commune or sleep in the adjoining dream room. While this must remain hypothetical, the evidence is suggestive. Alternative suggestions would be of interest to me. Let's turn to the situation further west now. A distinctive type of late Roman funerary monument isn't known, running in a broad arc from the Roman frontier zone to the Western Sahara in Mauritania. The northern part of this zone corresponds with the territory of multiple groups of people known in the ancient sources as Gaetuli, who've been characterized by Gabriel Camps as, quote, nomadic herders and redoubtable horsemen of the northern and western Sahara, end quote. This type of tomb is a so-called chapel tomb, generally a large circular or subrectangular tumulus with a central burial chamber and a separate and generally roofed-in chamber or chambers that were accessible from the exterior on the east side of the tomb. Again, that east side emphasis in all these cases. The chapels were sometimes simple corridors, sometimes more elaborate spaces with a T-shape and with side galleries. These were generally low and claustrophobic crawl spaces, but they allowed people in the descendant community to come very close to the east side of the actual burial chamber in the center of the monument. These are broadly dated to late antiquity. Such tumuli with funerary chapels have long been recognized as an important type of monument in this northwestern Saharan zone. Gabriel Camps was surely correct to recognize in them the physical manifestation of the practice of incubation, as mentioned by Herodotus and Mela. The evidence from the few excavated examples of these structures that were known to Camps suggested their use not only for sleeping close to the bones of powerful ancestors, thus to experience revelatory dreams, but also as sites of other performative rituals, attested by evidence of hearths and remains of possible ritual meals or offerings to the dead. I'm going to focus on a cluster of chapel tombs at Jf-Torba, close to the Algerian-Moroccan border in western Algeria, and in the Wadi Draa in southern Morocco. And there's further examples also known in between in the Tafilalt oasis zone. All three locations relate to important seasonal rivers. In the case of the Draa, it's a perennial one, in fact, that carry water from the Atlas Ranges deep into the Sahara. These locations were one where there seems to have been some pre-Islamic oasis development, and a key argument emerging from our recent work is that these burials, in part at least, relate to oasis cultivators rather than to nomads. Some of the tombs discovered at Jf-Torba in the 1940s yielded painted or engraved images from within the funerary chapels, though the poor level of publication of this material has for long hampered their full interpretation. In three important articles, Comps presented a strong case that these dated to the late antique period and that they revealed a desert people hundreds of kilometers beyond the Roman frontier that was strongly influenced by Mediterranean styles of representation of people and animals. The tombs of Jf-Torba are part of an extensive funerary landscape alongside the southeast side of the upper reaches of the Wadi or Guir, ancient Gir, a seasonal river, as I've said, flowing off the high Atlas. In years of peak flood, it used to carry water deep into the Sahara towards the Tuat oases. The original excavations by the French army captain Villalonga in 1948-49 were never published, though Regas included images of some of the painted stelae of horses and family groups in his 1950 book on Saharan burial monuments. A total of 7 painted and 4 engraved slabs were evidently recovered by Villalonga. The precise context of the images was not at the time certain, though both painted and engraved scenes were made on thin slabs of tabular stone with a maximum size of around 75 by 30 centimeters. From the later discoveries, it's clear that the panels were displayed in the funerary chapels, almost certainly the 2 largest tombs excavated, tombs 1 and 6, which we see on the screen. In 1966 to 67, another French military officer, Lihoru, returned to excavate further tombs, and the largest of these, Tomb 5, again on the screen, proved also to have had a complex funerary chapel attached to its east side, and 6 further examples of the painted panels were found, though only 3 had legible imagery. These panels, as we can see in the photo top right, were found in situ, leaning against the bottom of the walls of the westernmost chamber of the complex funerary chapel. At Jf-Torba, 2 important painted panels show groupings of men, women, and children in a line. These images are a good fit with the assumption that they relate to ancient ancestor worship. A multiplicity of individuals could indicate that the chapel served as centers of ancestor cult of wider lineage groups. In other words, people might go there to seek revelatory dreams involving any of a number of prominent ancestors memorialized in oral history, but perhaps also commemorated in images placed within the chapels. An alternative possibility is that the multiple images of individuals related to the people who are actively seeking to communicate with ancestral gods. It's me, so-and-so. The ornate pose certainly suggests links with mourning, with spiritual communication or prayer. I'm going to call these images family groups, though we cannot be sure whether they represent family ancestors or mourners and descendants, as I've explained. But close kinship can be assumed, I think, between the deceased and those who use the chapels. The ornate pose of many human figures and some aspects of the frontal representation evoke Mediterranean late antique styles. On the other hand, the distinctive and complex woven clothing of the individuals seems to represent Saharan traditions, especially the insect wing-shaped outer mantle or cloak of the male figure on the left of the panel. This is perhaps a relation of the more recent North African burnous, but with the finishes also to the West African agbaba, garment. Although the pigment palette used was fairly limited, mainly red, brown, white, and black, depictions of textile garments indicate complex woven patterns and bands indicating the use of colourful contrast. 2 of the women in this panel appear to be wearing some sort of veil on the lower faces. These were interpreted as beards by Lehoro, though in other respects their costume matches the flanking female figures. The images of male figures brandishing a spear in the right hand, with 2 more in reserve in the left, echoes other indigenous representations of Libyan warriors. the late Roman or late antique date inferred by Camps on stylistic grounds receives some support from 3 radiocarbon dates from bone recovered from the smaller tombs at the site, 2 of them giving a calibrated date range between the 2nd to 5th or 6th centuries CE. The second family group is much less well preserved, but contains a number of interesting features. Again, we have a family group of a man brandishing 3 spears, with to his right a lineup of 4 women or children. Above the figures, there are 5 columns of Libyan script, most probably the names of the 5 people depicted here. There's a large gap in the scene between the dominant male and 2 oryxes at the left-hand edge of the slab, though traces of paint indicate that something filled this space. And looking at the traces of pigment surviving here, I think there's a possibility of reconstructing 2 horses facing to the right, one above the other. Now, since 2015, I've carried out a program of fieldwork in southern Morocco, co-directed with Yusuf Bokbot, Corey Fenwick, and Martin Sterry, through 2 projects, the Middle Draa project and then the Oasis Civilization project, which is still ongoing. Wadi Draa, as I explained, is another of the rivers that takes its source from the high and anti-Atlas ranges. And before the installation of a modern dam towards its upper end, this wadi had a year-round flow to just below the sharp westward turn of the wadi at the place named as Larjam on the slide, from where the valley is largely dry till it reaches the Atlantic coast around 500 kilometers away. Our initial remote sensing and survey work has identified numerous Iron Age settlements and cemetery zones along the course of the valley, mainly closely concentrated on the river. And there's a particularly dense concentration of tombs around Larjam. The largest of the tumuli can reach 13 to 15 meters in diameter, and it's these large monuments that house the funerary chapels. We'd heard rumors of a painted tomb having been briefly opened in this Larjam area by clandestine diggers in the late 1990s. And in the course of our fieldwork, we were able to relocate the cemetery. This is ringed on the map. Then in November 2016, we carried out some brief trial excavations at this site, known as Boo 57, and were subsequently able to conduct more extensive work on tombs 1 to 3 in 2021. All 3 of these tombs proved to be chapel tombs. Another important element of our 2021 work was excavation in an adjacent Iron Age village settlement, this is Boo 52, which suggested contemporaneity, or at least some overlap in period of use. The inhabitants of the village were certainly cultivating cereals. As we suspected, painted images previously reported came from funerary chapels built into the east side of the tumuli, but in addition to painted stone plaques placed against the chapel walls in a similar manner to Jf-Torba, we also found lots of evidence of additional decoration and figural scenes painted directly onto the walls of the chapels. This was best preserved in tombs 1 and 2, and the tombs are shown in order 1, 2, 3 on the screen. I'm going to focus on tombs 1 and 2 today because the paintings were best preserved there, although there were traces of pigment also in tomb 3. This discovery raises the probability that most such chapel tombs were originally painted, with the pigment having been eroded away elsewhere by eventual exposure to the elements. All 3 of our tombs had a subrectangular form around 12 by 7 meters, with a centrally positioned burial shaft lying to the west of the funerary chapels that were accessed from the east side of the monument. There were also additional offering structures built outside the tomb to the east, and those are in red on the slide. Funerary chapels originally had slab roofs over the chapel space, allowing only about 1 meter headroom, so those entering will have had to go in on all fours or squatting. Each chapel was different in its precise architectural form, though all had a centrally placed niche in the west wall nearest to the primary burial chamber. Most of the preserved paintwork was found on that western wall of the chapels, especially concentrated around the niche, with the most complex scenes in tombs 1 and 2 situated directly below the niche. Several radiocarbon dates have been obtained so far from tomb 1, more awaited. And these came from a hearth in the funerary chapel and from a piece of charcoal sealed beneath a stele in the corner of the room. These dates range from the first millennium BC to the first half of the first millennium CE, and taking into account the probable old wood effect here, a date in the 3rd to 6th century CE seems quite plausible and in line with other indicators. Our excavations of the robbed funerary chambers in these tombs have revealed multiple burials in each tomb, not just a single individual. There were a minimum of 2 people in tomb 1 and a maximum of 7 in tomb 3. In tomb 1, the western wall consisted of roughly coarse limestone slabs, many of which have been painted and decorated in situ with red, white, and black pigment. The image here has been enhanced to accentuate the impact of the paintings, which concentrated, as you can see, especially around the central niche. Much of the painting comprised geometric patterns, but there were also a number of human figures. In this and subsequent imagery, I shall mostly show false and enhanced colour images, as the originals are often rather faded, and it's easier to see the detail on these false colour images. False colour images were generated by my colleague Hamza Benatia Magarejo using the D-Stretch software. As you'll see, different colour balances accentuate varied features of the images, much of which are not visible on the original photos. In this tomb, there are 2 main blocks with human figures below the niche. On one, shown on the slide here, only the figure at the right-hand side was preserved, though there are traces of pigment that indicate that there were additional figures originally further to the left. These have been damaged by the heat from a hearth that had been built on the floor in front of the wall. The preserved figure is a probable female with medium-length straight black hair, a long white rectangular tunic with a red border and arms raised in the orient position. The photo to bottom right shows the northern end of the chapel gallery, where several thin stone slabs with paintings on are visible, strewn on the chapel floor, and a stele stands in situ in the northwest corner. On the block to the north of the aforementioned female figure below the niche, there was a group of 3 figures, again in the orient position with arms raised, elbows bent, and palms facing out, strongly reminiscent of the Jf-Torba family groups. The scene comprises a man with traces of a probable spear in his left hand, in a black thigh-length tunic and a white insect wing cloak with a red border. To his right, there's a woman in a white tunic and a smaller figure to her right, presumably representing a child, though depicted wearing one of the wing mantle garments over a tunic and brandishing spears like the adult male. In tomb 2, paintwork on the west wall of the chapel was less well preserved, though a main block with multiple figures was right below the niche, with a further thin block decorated with 2 male figures to the right of the niche. In this tomb, there were many additional painted human figures on other walls of the main access corridor and in the other outer pair of galleries. The main family group in tomb 2 was painted on a large flat slab of rather patinated rock. In a couple of places, the painters seem to have tried to chip away areas of the patina to make the images more legible, but elsewhere they just painted straight onto the patinated surface. With the effects of time, this makes it hard to make out all the detail, but trust me, there are 9 figures painted here, all evidently portrayed in the orient pose and a horse. It's easiest to see in this simplified line drawing. The figures split into 3 main groups. To the left, we have a large round-headed figure, number 4, in a thigh-length tunic, brandishing spears, overlapping slightly with a smaller masculine-looking figure, number 3, also with spears and an insect wing cloak. To the left, there's a very small standing infant, 2, and finally, a probable female figure with a long 3-panel tunic, this is number 1. The second group commences with a figure 5, with a strange tri-lobed headdress or hairstyle and a short squarish tunic. Trace of a spear survives by the right hand. The tri-lobed head decoration is paralleled in Saharan rock art and evidently is a sign of some prestige in desert society. At the right edge of the stone, there are traces of a second large masculine figure, number 8, with spears, and between the two, what may be a female figure, number 7, in a tripartite long rectangular tunic, and a smaller figure in tunic and wing cloak that may represent a male child. Figures 1 to 4 and 5 to 8 could represent separate branches of a family, with adult male and female and a younger and adolescent child in each group. Below the second group, there's a clear horse with a small human rider, 9 and 10. These family groups from tombs 1 and 2 show clear parallels with the Jf-Torba images in relation to the types of garments depicted, the frontal positioning in the orant pose, the association of spears with what appear to be male individuals, and the importance of the horse. On the walls of Tomb 2 and on several thin slabs on the chapel floor of Tomb 1, there are other representations of the armed warrior. The Tomb 2 example, shown here on the left, shows 2 figures in red tunics with white insect wing cloaks, each clutching a spear in their right hand and 2 in the left. The thin dimensions of the block here have led to extreme truncation of the legs, although the exaggerated cone shape of these suggests that the intention is to portray a narrowing from thigh to ankle. The 2 examples from Tomb 1 reflect a different way of depicting the body as a biconical figure, a mode of representation that's also well known among the Garamantes. There's an attempt in both images to represent the wing cloak and the spears. The further image on a detached slab portrays a bearded man in the orant position with a black-edged white cloak over a brown-edged short red tunic. The different de-stretch images here show how different colour mixing brings out hidden features. Note in particular the lines of white dots forming a pattern on the upper part of the tunic, top right, and the possible indication of a woven triangular pattern on the spread cloak. The thin slabs in Tomb 1 were various shapes and sizes that were similar to the Jf-Torba material and had originally evidently been placed against the western wall to supplement images painted thereon. As a result of careful inquiries about the circumstances of the original discovery of Tomb 2, we were eventually able to recover 2 flat slabs that had apparently been found within the chapel when it was opened clandestinely, one showing a solo female figure and the other 2 figures in long robes. The former is particularly well-preserved representation of a woman with shoulder-length dark hair and coal-blackened eyes, wearing a long yellow tunic with indications that it was made in 3 thin panels, over which she wore a long red overmantle, edged with white, representing presumably beads or shells. She is in the orant pose and has bare feet with toes and fingers well distinguished. The panel with 2 figures is extremely faded, see top left for its actual state, but with digital enhancement, a lot of detail is revealed. It appears that an attempt was made to clean this panel by the person who recovered it in the 1990s, and parts of the right-hand figure in particular have been smudged and erased as a result. Both the figures are wearing long rectangular kaftan-like garments, out of which their stick-like arms and legs protrude. The garments appear to be sleeveless, with a front divided into 3 panels. The lower corners had large weighted tassels to help give the garment shape, and a fringe of smaller tassels ran along the bottom edge. The tunic of the left-hand figure had a central red panel bordered by 2 plain, unpainted panels, but which are decorated with red zigzags. The right-hand figure had the reverse arrangement with 2 outer red panels flanking a plain central panel divided into 3 zones, with the upper and lower parts decorated with the red zigzag design. This seems a clear attempt to indicate woven garments with a geometric dogtooth design worked into it. The heads of the 2 figures are somewhat indistinct, but they had a rather triangular hairstyle, with the length of which suggests they may be female. This might also be indicated by the below-knee length of their garments. The arms appear to be raised in the orant position, but it's not clear if they had anything in their hands. In presenting and interpreting all this material, there are a number of dangers to be acknowledged. The first objection that could reasonably be raised is how confident can we be about the gender ascriptions advanced on the basis of often rather crudely depicted and not always perfectly preserved figures. On the other hand, if we think about the circumstances of viewing the imagery by flickering lamplight in subterranean chambers and the assumed association with ancestor worship, where identification of individual characters was probably important in the sorts of transactions envisaged, it seems logical that the iconographic program followed a visual syntax. especially in things like sexual dimorphism. Looking across the corpus overall, and including the Jf-Torba material, and quite a lot of additional Saharan rock art, there are some plausibly gendered characteristics that can be highlighted, I think. Male figures seem to wear shorter, narrower, rectangular tunics. With the butterfly wing cloaks, they carry spears, often in a combination of one in the right and two in the left hand, something that is well paralleled in the rock art from the Sahara, where the spearheads are often more distinctly depicted. Male heads tend to be rounder, with shorter hair and sometimes beards depicted. Women seem to be portrayed with longer and wider rectangular tunics, often divided into 3 vertical panels, sometimes with that indication of tassels on the lower corners and under edge. There are rare indications of an overgarment that seems a bit different to the insect wing cloak. They tend to have long necks and elongated faces, longer black hair in an inverted V shape. There may be some small exceptions in one of these characteristics, but normally there's strong congruence across the majority of the characteristics to suggest the gender of individual figures. So while the simple answer is that we cannot be absolutely certain about this, I think the balance of probability is that male and female dress was being differently depicted in the paintings. Children generally follow the model of the adult male or female figures, but in miniature size according to their sex. That in turn suggests that sometimes elaborate clothing styles that we see depicted had social meaning in calling upon powerful ancestors for assistance. While it's not clear, as I've mentioned, whether we should read our painted figures as the spirits of the ancestors or as the descendants putting on their holiday best clothes for the purposes of communicating with the ancestors, there are clear indications that these were prestige garments that evoked wealth and power within the society. As I noted earlier, many of the simpler paintings on the walls were geometric designs, and these can occasionally feature on the detached plaques as well. The designs vary considerably from chevrons, diagonal lines, zigzags, dog teeth, rhomboids, lattice work, checkerboard, triangles, and with interior dotting, squares overlain by circles, vertical lines, and so on. While the inspiration for these patterns and their significance must remain speculative, it's noteworthy that these are all common motifs in textile weaving, and in view of the indication of the zigzag patterning on 2 of the painted figures, it's certainly possible that many of the other garments represented in simplified form in the paintings were originally multicolored and highly patterned too. So it seems possible to me, at any rate, that the geometric patterns could have been referencing the quality of the garments in which revered ancestors were to be addressed. That is, they add additional meaning to the dress depictions where such details were harder to show realistically. There is some additional evidence I'll turn to now relating to Saharan textiles of this period to support such a suggestion. For instance, if we return to the case of the Garamantes, we now know that this people initiated oasis cultivation early in the 1st millennium BCE, and that by the early centuries CE, there were hundreds of sedentary oasis villages in their territory and a few centres of urban scale. The rule of kings and other evidence establishes this as an early Saharan polity. As well as being accomplished oasis farmers and traders, they were also pioneers in pyrotechnical and other manufacturing technologies, including very high-quality spinning and weaving. There are hints of their capacity to produce high-quality textiles in the Saharan painted rock art contemporary with their civilization. In this image from the Caucasus Mountains to the southwest of their territory, we see 2 figures in the Orient pose, we might note, wearing large rectangular garments made up of a series of vertical dyed panels. My excavations of Garamantian burials have also recovered fragments of high-quality woven and dyed textiles, including geometric patterns such as a checkerboard of coloured squares and banded designs. Garamantian textiles were weft-faced and could comprise as many as 56 threads, 28 pairs per centimetre, and often with highly decorative selvages. Examples have been found of large woven-in panels in a distinctive colour, as in the example in the lower right of the slide. The Garamantes wove not only wool but also cotton, which they were cultivating from around the 4th century BCE. This allowed them to produce even finer woven fabrics, but the cotton textiles, by and large, are much less well conserved in the tomb environment. These are fragmentary and tantalizing traces of Garamantian textiles, but give a clear indication. But by the early centuries CE, if not well before, the Garamantes had a well-established and sophisticated textile production, which no doubt supported some vivid wardrobe choices in the Central Sahara. We look once again to Gerza in the Libyan pre-desert. The relief carvings from the 4th century tombs there portray prominent individuals in the community, as we noted, but again in a manner that seems to link to ancestor worship. The left-hand images here show these individuals often wore distinctive garments, a long rectangular tunic with a delineated central panel on the left and a banded cloak or tunic decorated with triangles or dogtooth design in the second image. The same site has also yielded some early medieval woven and embroidered textiles believed to date to the 7th to 9th centuries CE, with well-preserved designs that feature triangles, lozenges, chevrons, squares, lattices, and so on, paralleling extremely closely the sort of geometric paintings that we saw from Booth 57. It may well be that the medieval Gerza textiles thus represent the continuation of a long-established Saharan weaving tradition. Returning to the Booth 57 tombs, with one final piece of evidence attesting to really high-quality textile manufacture in this community, in the form of mud impressions from the burial shafts of the tombs. These provide traces of the finely woven shrouds and garments that individuals have been buried in. Some of the weaving is so pristine it's likely that these were specially woven for deposition in the burials and had not been previously used. A final report on this cemetery will also present evidence of the technical details of these textiles and their weaving patterns. Initial assessments suggest both woolen and plant fibre threads of varying fineness were being used. So the tombs and iconography that we've encountered at Jf-Torba and Booth 57 seem to belong to a distinctive Saharan cultural koine. The people here seem to have combined both mobile elements and sedentary populations, and they were responsible for precocious oasis development in the northern Sahara. The people who painted those funerary chapels in the Draa were at least semi-sedentarized, practicing agriculture, making high-quality textiles, raising and revering horses, with religious activity also apparently closely focused around important ancestors and the chthonic forces to be encountered in the subterranean funerary chapels. The images of ancestors and the geometric patterns observed in flickering flame light, combined with effects of smoke inhalation from fires or material burned on the hearth, no doubt contributed to a probable hallucinogenic aspect designed to bring on those revelatory dreams. To conclude, the remarkable painted funerary chapels at Jf-Torba and at Fum-Lajam open a window into a world of late antique desert society in North Africa. In the style of depiction of people and horses, we may recognize artistic links not only spreading along the northern edge of the Sahara, but also across the Roman frontier, well into the Roman provinces to the north. Production and trade in quality textiles also followed these routes, and appears to be an important economic activity for these Saharan communities, as well as serving internal needs for status display. Although the late Roman or late antique date of Jf-Torba has for long been assumed, it's made more likely by the discovery of the Lajam examples. The signs of emerging social hierarchy are reflected in the differences in tomb architecture and the scale of monuments to the most significant ancestors. The indications of ancestor worship in southern Morocco echo elements also observed in the Saharan heartlands of the Garamantes and at the Libyan pre-desert site of Gerza, as we've seen. The images related to ancestor worship at Gerza, Jf-Torba, and Fum-Lajam highlight the power structures that underlay such transactions by the representation of ornate costumes. I suggest that in seeking the assistance of powerful ancestors, the community at Lajam depicted either themselves or their ancestors in their most prestigious and showy garments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. What a revelation for an area which has traditionally, as you said, been seen as backward and nomadic. Open up the questions. If I can kick off the questions just by asking, do we know what they're using for paints? Do we know what the pigments are? And is that leading into understanding of context?
We've got some analysis underway on the pigments. In fact, I was hoping the person doing the analysis was going to be here today, but she had to be elsewhere. So I hadn't prepared the answer to that question. I knew it was going to come because I thought I'd be able to point at her and say, over to you. Then there's quite a lot of ochre involved in across the thing. You know, the white appears to be some sort of clay-based substance, and the black is sort of charcoaly, carbony. But we'll have a more technical explanation.
We'll to learn. We'll now pass around. Anushka will bring the mic so that people online can hear.
Can you hear all right? Yeah, David, thank you so much. And you put your team members on your first slide. Are the locals welcoming to you? Is it possible for you to become embedded? And is observation of their customs today in any way helpful to understand what I gather is text-free evidence?
Yeah, this is a very special area of the Sahara. It's what we would call a Berber area. The Amazigh people, the original autochthonous inhabitants of North Africa, and they associate very strongly, in fact, with a cultural heritage that goes back before Islam, which is quite unusual within North Africa. So that we do have quite a lot of buy-in to what we're doing with our heritage. And obviously one of our hopes is that we can create something here that will really celebrate this, you know, previously unseen, unheralded heritage of the desert communities. I mean, just whilst we're waiting for the mic to be passed on, one of the problems, of course, of working in an area like this where hardly any work has been previously done is that we're starting from the bottom and building up slowly with the work that we can do.
I just wondered, you mentioned all the settlements are along seasonal river valleys, or were. What do we actually know about the climate in these areas at the time of the peak of the artwork?
Yeah. So we do know that the Sahara has at certain times experienced really significant climate change, but the last really major climate change was about 5,000 years ago, so well before this time. And in fact, it's really because of that climate change that people become obliged to think about new ways of living in the desert, and that means exploiting the ecologically favored niches like river valleys where you get water coming down either perennially or on a regular enough basis that you can use it to irrigate and create agriculture in those areas. So that's, this is oasis agriculture born out of adversity rather than out of a kind of opportunity, I would say.
An online question, could the cultivation of the oases be seasonal and thus an element of mobility or semi-nomadic for the Gaetuli and Garamantes?
The Garamantes, I think the first evidence for the Garamantes of oasis agriculture is around 1000 BCE. And, in the course of the first millennium BCE, it's clear that they become very sedentary, or at least the core society. And there are literally hundreds of villages we now know that are directly associated with areas of oasis garden and irrigation systems. In the case of the Wadi Draa, the oasis development is happening about 1,000 years later. And so, there must be early stages of this when people are starting to become semi-sedentary. And really, we probably need to do more work in terms of excavating the settlement sites to really assess the extent to which they are in occupation all year round. However, once you start cultivating an oasis, there are jobs that need doing pretty much all year round. So it's likely that some part of the society is going to become sedentary pretty quickly. And as we saw, we've got, that permanent open village site really close by the painted tombs.
Thank you. Are you able to say anything else about the sort of belief systems of these people with their orant position, arms raised and so forth? I mean, which we tend to think of as being an early Christian type of thing, but I'm guessing this is pre-Christian or what?
I mean, if we look at the orant pose is very often associated with Christianity because it appears a lot in early Christian art, but it's also present in pagan religion around the Mediterranean and certainly in North Africa, features in the Saharan rock art. It seems to be a very, it's about communication with divine forces, and that goes back before Christianity. And one of the reasons the Jf-Torba ones were suggested to be late antique is that it's a Christian association. But it seems to me there's a basic contradiction between an idea that these people are Christian, but they're also ancestor worshipping at the same time. So I don't, I think this is something that develops out of this Saharan pagan tradition, and the fact that they don't seem to have quite so many gods of a more conventional form that these ancestors really are important, I think, is borne out by the fact that we are so lacking in temples. One of the other sites we found, which is a fascinating site, perhaps a separate lecture, is a hill fort, which seems to have a kind of religious area within it, which has no buildings in it, but every boulder and rock face within that area is covered in images, engravings of horses and horse and riders. And that seems to be something that, represents another aspect of the religion of these people. Again, it's interesting that we also get those references to the horse and rider in the tombs as well.
Hi, thanks very much. I wanted to ask a bit about the insect wings.
Yes.
Do they belong to any one type of insect, like a locust, or is it simply a generic?
That was just my description of the shape of them,
Right.
the way they hang, rather than what they're made. We assume that these are textile garments.
Right. Oh, well, in that case, because I was going to ask actually whether they thought that wearing wings would sort of allow them to fly, but obviously that's not relevant now.
Yeah. Well, who knows? I mean, imagine them riding their horses with those cloaks. They would have blown out in quite a suggestive way.
If there are no further questions, I think we've had a sort of revelatory lecture. I know from other people who are working in this part of Northern Africa that we're beginning, I think, to see a new archaeology of an area that's largely been neglected, at least by Anglophone scholarship in the past. So we're extremely grateful to David for coming and presenting first view of this. Clearly there's a lot more to see and to happen, and we wish you the very best with your future research. If we can express our thanks. Just two further announcements. Firstly, I know that there are some leaflets for the Roman Society and possibly the Hellenic Society, if people want to pick them up as they leave. Strongly encourage you to support those two of our sister societies. And I give notice that the next of our lunchtime lectures, public lectures, will be The Nubian Pharaohs of Egypt by Professor Adrian Dobson on Tuesday, the 4th of June at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.